All right. Good morning, Mike. Good morning, Tracy. How are we doing today?
Doing well, thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah. Good morning.
Hey. All right. So let's get into it. You are here. Well, first, let's talk about what department y'all are going to be discussing with students today and what your roles are. How, if students come into the office and see you there, what can they expect of you? What is your role and how can they interact with your office or your department, I guess, basically?
Well, I'll start first. I'm Tracy Hurd. I'm the Assistant Director of Student Accessibility Services here on the Dahlonega campus. And Student Accessibility Services works with students who have disabilities and need accommodations for equal access in the classroom or just around campus. In Dahlonega, of course, we also have the residential component, and so we also work with students in housing who may need accommodations. Mike?
Yeah, I'm Mike Enright, and I'm a student accessibility coordinator on the Gainesville campus. And I do much the same work that Tracy does, help students with getting access to their academic environment. Since we don't have resident halls on the Gainesville campus yet, that's not a function of what we do, but otherwise we do pretty much the same thing.
Awesome, awesome. And so just so students understand, so now that they know what your department office is, how can they actually register with student accessibility services? What does that process look like? How can they get started with it? And how do they get in contact with your department?
So if a student has a disability and they would like to register with their office, the easiest way to find that registration page is to go to UNG's website, which is www.ung.edu. And in the search bar, type in SAS for Student Accessibility Services. One of the things that comes back in that search return is register with SAS. And they can click right there, and that will take them directly to the registration page. They'll need to fill out an intake form. It's very simple, just questions about them and their disability. And then they do have to submit documentation of their disability that meets the Board of Regents guidelines. If the documentation that they submit to us doesn't meet the Board of Regents guidelines, then we can always work with them to provide them with provisional accommodations while they get the documentation that does meet those guidelines.
All right, and you will hear a lawnmower in my background. Please ignore it, and I hope you can still hear me. So that actually leads me to my next question about documentation. So the few times that I have worked with students with disabilities, I've noticed that sometimes that component can be a difficult process, or they don't necessarily know how to get that, or they don't have the ability to get it for whatever reason. So if I'm a student and I don't necessarily have the documentation to support certain disability or certain parts of my disability, whatever the case may be, what can your department do for me? Will it be just an end all be all if I walk in and I don't have those documents, or are there still ways to work with me as a student?
There are definitely still ways to work with students who don't have that documentation. We obviously don't want any student to be struggling, and so we want to work with them. If students don't have that documentation, then we do have forms that we can give them to take to their healthcare providers. A lot of it is going to depend on the student's disability as to what we recommend for them to do as far as getting that documentation. But we do have a form that we can give to them to ask their healthcare provider to complete that lists their functional limitations in regards to their diagnoses. And that's what we need to know, is how their disability limits them in an academic setting. And that allows us to determine appropriate accommodations for them. Now, for students who have learning disabilities, ADHD, those types of things, oftentimes we will suggest and ask them to get what's called a psychoeducational evaluation. That is just a really, really good way to determine what those functional limitations are. And oftentimes students will have co-occurring diagnoses, and that evaluation can actually uncover some of those that maybe students didn't realize that they had. And it lets us know that they need more accommodations than what they thought they did and what originally we would have thought that they were eligible for. And so that's a very helpful tool for us to be able to determine that. And so there are multiple ways that students can obtain an evaluation, and we have information on that we also give to students.
That is awesome to hear. And that actually leads me to my next question. So the way I understand it, accommodations are not always just you walk in on your first day of college and then you have it for the time that you're there. So there are, from what I understand, different types of accommodations, and they don't all necessarily last your duration of college or even for the semester or for the year. So can you explain a little bit about what those different accommodations can look like, and what the different types are? What should students know if they're told I have this type of accommodation, basically?
So there are basically three types of accommodations. There are provisional accommodations, and those are very limited in scope and also limited in time. Those are generally given for one semester while we wait for a student to get the documentation that meets that Board of Regents guidelines. If we see that a student is really working towards getting that documentation that they need, but perhaps there's a delay in them being able to get an evaluation, but they have an appointment, then we can possibly extend those provisionals. But again, they're very limited in scope, and also they do have an expiration date. Permanent accommodations are when a student has presented us with the documentation that meets the Board of Regents guidelines, and they are approved for those accommodations. They have those the entire time that they are enrolled here as a student at UNG. Even if they graduate from their bachelor's program and they come back to a graduate program, then they still can have those accommodations. So anytime they are enrolled as a student here at UNG, once they've been approved for permanent accommodations, they are, just as the name implies, permanent. They are there for them to use. Temporary accommodations are accommodations that are for a temporary illness or injury. And so again, those are accommodations that a student doesn't need the entire time that they're going to be here, because that illness or injury is going to resolve. And so the accommodations are also going to go away because they don't need them the entire time. So if a student has surgery, a temporary illness, they have an injury, they break a bone, have a concussion, something like that, we can work with them to provide those temporary accommodations as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because in my first week of college at the first university I was at, I sprained my ankle. I was literally just walking down like steps and I missed a step, and they referred me to the accommodations office to help me get escort to my classes and make sure that I had a place to sit in every class, because at that first university they had some older buildings that you can only access with stairs, and I couldn't get to them. And so it's not just for students with necessarily disabilities. If you're sick or if something happens to you and you need help getting to class, or you need help with whatever the case may be, or maybe extensions on assignments because you're going to be out for 2 weeks, your office does also help in those instances, even if it's just for a few weeks or if it's for a few months, whatever the case is. Yeah,
we do. Now, if it's something where a student is going to be out for an extended time, that's something where they need to go through the Dean of Students office, though. That's not something that our office handles. So if it's excused absences, but we work in conjunction with the Dean of Students office to provide accommodations that they may need in the classroom. But as far as absences for those types of things, they would need to go through the Dean of Students office.
Thank you for clarifying that. I almost forgot that. Which also brings me to my next question. So when you are doing accommodations, let's say that I had a temporary one, but I still may need it more accommodations for the next semester. what does it look like to, I guess, renew accommodations or to make sure that I'm gonna have them for the following semester or 2 semesters down?
If it's a temporary accommodation for an illness or an injury, we would just need to have that documentation updated by the physicians showing that there is still a need for the accommodation. Now, again, if the accommodations are permanent, they're permanent. You don't need to renew them every semester. Provisional accommodations, again, those are going to expire. And so we need the documentation to make those permanent in order to get those going for another semester.
Okay,
Yeah, and
cool.
we assist students every time they get a new set of professors in getting that list of accommodations to each of their professors. So that's, we kind of show them how to do that because it's very student-led. The student has to take the responsibility to get those accommodation notices to the right people. So every semester when you get new instructors, we will help students to navigate that process.
Awesome. I'm glad y'all clarified that because sometimes at different universities, I feel like it works differently. So I'm glad that you clarified that, like here, if that happens, you will have to provide that to your professors, but you will be given documentation to give them, and you won't have to worry about having to provide like your proof to every single individual professor, just whatever the office gives you. Which leads me to my next question. So now that we've established what types of accommodations there are, how to go about getting accommodations, well, I guess I want to touch a little bit more on what accommodations does your office actually offer? Because that word accommodations, it is a big umbrella term. And you've touched on that a little bit, but when it comes to sitting down with a student and trying to figure out what is best going to suit them, what are things that you guys consider? Because one type of accommodation obviously doesn't fit for everybody. So what is the different types of things that you guys can actually do to help students fit in the academic world, help them getting to class, things like that?
Well, there's not, again, a one size fits all. Just because a student comes in with a particular diagnosis doesn't mean that they're going to get a certain set of accommodations. So we meet with every student who needs accommodations, and we talk about, again, those limitations, and we determine based on their limitations the accommodations that would best meet their needs, and then determine which accommodations are appropriate for them based on those needs and their limitations. There are some more common accommodations, but that doesn't mean that every student's going to get them. But excuse me, some of the more common accommodations are extended time for testing, a quiet room for testing. Some students need assistance with note taking, either with assistive technology or through different means. Those are some common accommodations. There are some other not common accommodations that students may actually qualify for as well. But again, that's all determined by whatever their limitations are.
Gotcha. That's great to hear because I've worked with students with different disabilities and it never really looks the same. Everybody requires different things to fit their life, what their disabilities are, and how they feel comfortable interacting with the academic settings. Because it's not always just, oh, well, I need this one thing. Like I need this thing, but then I need this thing to do homework. I need this thing to take notes. It's a different thing for every person that you look at, and it's important to know that when you walk into the office, you guys are there to help them find what they need, what's going to work for them, and all that good stuff.
I might also add, it's not a one and done. We don't just meet with a student, give them their accommodations, and send them on their way. If they get their accommodations and get into the classroom and then find that they're still struggling, they can certainly come back to us and we will work with them to find another solution that will meet their needs. So things may change as we go along.
Yeah, I've seen that happen with students as well, where they think that, oh, I just need this one thing, and then they realize throughout the semester that they're still struggling, that they had this other obstacle, especially when it comes to certain courses that are a little bit more challenging, like with math courses. That's something that if you can't write, it's kind of hard to put that into a computer to complete homework assignments. So I'm glad that you touched on that. Which brings me to another question actually, which is what else does your office do other than just help with accommodations? How basically do you guys act like the cheerleaders of students with disabilities?
Well, we provide testing spaces for students with accommodations, so they actually can come to our office to do their exams. And so we get a lot of that one-on-one when students come in to test. We have a lot of students who test with us on a regular basis. So we really get to know our students pretty well. We know when they've done well on exams. We know when they didn't do so well on exams. And we're here to cheer them along, of course. We also refer students out if they come to us and tell us that they're having a hard time with something. We can refer them out to other services. We actually, if a student lets us know they have a specific need for organization, working on scheduling their classes. We know that advisors and of course academic coaches do that as well, but we're also happy to sit down with students and help them walk through that process. For some students who have particular disabilities, reaching out to others on campus that they're not familiar with is a difficult process. And so we can help them feel a little bit more comfortable with some of those processes that they're not used to doing. And so when they feel a little bit more comfortable with the process, then they feel a little bit more comfortable reaching out to others. We also, of course, make sure that they're engaged in tutoring, that sort of thing. We sponsor for incoming freshmen every year what we call the First Year Foundation. And that is just where we also bring them in, get to know them a little bit better face to face, and go over some of the processes for using their accommodations. Again, we touch on all of the resources on campus that are available to them, and just kind of it's sort of an orientation to being registered with our office.
Yeah, we also do some interfacing with faculty so that they're used to the types of accommodations, and if they have questions, because it may be new to them to have a student that gets an accommodation in class. So we do a lot of professional development and working with faculty and staff. Maybe awareness would be the best way to put that.
That's great to hear. Yeah, I feel like you guys are kind of just not in a bubble that just work with the students. I feel like you also are part of the university community and trying to engage those students with their professors, with faculty, which is so important, because when you have a disability, it sometimes feels like, well, I just have to go about life however it is, when it's not really like that. We have so many resources and so many people who want to help. It's just that first step of reaching out, and then from there it's really easy. So that was actually my last question. Is there anything else you guys want to touch on that you want students to know before we hop off?
Other things that our office does behind the scenes that people don't necessarily see is to work on campus to make sure that facilities are accessible, and making sure that the accessibility things that are already in place are actually working well. So every semester we'll go around, check all of the automatic door openers, check the elevators, things like that. And if anything we find is not in good working order, then we report that to facilities to make sure that that gets taken care of. If anyone sees anything on campus that isn't working, then they can certainly report that to us, and we will take care of making sure that it gets reported to get repaired. If there are things that you see on campus that aren't accessible, that need to be accessible, curb cuts where, you know, a wheelchair can go, if you see a place where those need to be put in, then ours is the office where you can report that, and we will work with facilities to make sure that those sorts of things get taken care of.
And contact us early. Don't wait until you're in too deep. Come to us as soon as you think, oh, there's an issue. So we can help early on. We're here all year, summer, winter, all the time.
Yeah, I'm glad you guys mentioned those things. They're things that I always assume that your office does, but I don't actually know that I can go say, hey, this thing is broken. Can y'all let somebody know? Or I don't know when I'm supposed to reach out. I've already started my classes, but I need help with this. And someone, you know, give me an appointment. I feel like that's all really important information that sometimes students don't always know that they have at their disposal. All right. Thank you very much for your time, y'all. I
You're
hope
welcome.
that students got a good idea of what your department is, what y'all do, and how they can reach out to you. Yeah, I enjoyed talking to y'all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good one. Bye.
Bye-bye.